It's hard to believe that it's been 30 years plus. I knew it wasn't 30 because Kathy and I celebrated our 31st anniversary this year, and we got married 3 months after this building opened. So I knew the time frame of it. And this afternoon, I've been asked to talk about the long and winding road, how this church got here. And so I'm going to share a little bit of our history and just share with you some of the things that we went through to make the West Freeway congregation a reality. For some of you, it will be old history. Hopefully for some of you, it will be enlightening, and at least it got me all excited. I had forgotten how wonderful it was when we actually put all this together. So we'll be talking about that here in just a minute. Have you ever made plans for one of those family outings? You know, I knew of a family once. They were going to go cut Christmas trees at the holidays, and they were going to go out in the country, and they were going to cut the tree and make a big day out of it. The kids were going to get involved, and it was going to be spectacular. They would come home singing carols in the car and having a great time, you know. As it turned out, the snow got worse, the blizzard got bad. It took them 3 hours to get to the farm. By the time they got there, they were all nervous and exhausted and frustrated. And when they got there, because of the blizzard, there was no farm. It was closed. They had to turn around and drive back. By that time, they're fighting with one another. Mom and Dad are at it. The kids in the back seat are at it. Dad has to finally turn around and say, "Shut up, I'm arguing with your mom, let me be." And on the way home, what'd they do? They stopped at Walmart and bought a plastic tree. You know, the dream we have about an event and then the reality that comes are often quite different. And I think that's especially true when it comes to church work, because I think we all have an image of what the church ought to be, what it ought to look like, how it ought to function. And I know I got lots of preachers here, and I know every one of us, when we've thought of a new ministry or a new direction, a new whatever, we have this image of what it'll be, but the reality is often quite a bit messier. One of the wonderful things about the West Freeway congregation back in the day is that we managed to make the dream a reality. There was something going on in this movement, this merger, that was just bigger than any of us. It was exciting, there was passion, there was joy, there was exhilaration. I think for a while, we captured exactly what God wanted a church to be. Now, I'm going to try to tell this story, and I'm going to warn you, it's been 30 years. I might misremember something here and there. And I'm going to tell it from the way I experienced it, because that's the only way I know to do it. And so if you experienced it differently, you can argue with me on your way home after we're all done. That's fine. And I'm not going to try to keep you here with all the details, but I want to share with you what was going on in West Fort Worth. There were a bunch of churches, all of them in the same size range except for one, which was smaller, and pretty much isolated. The only thing we really had to do with one another was the men's softball league. That was where we met the brothers from the other churches. And that was a lot of fun, but there wasn't much real fellowship or connection. And so this afternoon, for my time, I want to share with you how we got here, and I'm going to do it in 3 acts. And I could have put a PowerPoint up there, but I think I just need to tell you the story. And so 3 acts that I want to share with you. The first act was a very simple one, and that's what I would describe as an act of God. The Sunset congregation was down just off Clover Lane on the old West Freeway. And they got notice from the Texas Department of Transportation they were taking their property. Now, they gave them a good price for the property. It sure wasn't cheating us. But the Sunset congregation had to find a new place to meet. Well, if you go down into Arlington Heights, there's no empty land to speak of, so they began looking and looking and looking. And they wound up not far from a congregation called the Ridgely West congregation out on the west side. Well, they got to talking, how can we build a building within earshot of another congregation? And so the Ridgely West leadership, the Sunset leadership began to talk, and somebody suggested a merger. And out of that, the Cook Heights congregation, which is in White Settlement, or was in White Settlement, volunteered to come in too. Very quickly, the White Settlement Church, where I was a minister, we decided to come in. And finally, toward the process unfolding, the Westland congregation, the small church of just a few members, wound up coming in. We wound up with 5 churches, all with their own customs, their own traditions, their own ways of doing things, all of a sudden making plans to come buy property somewhere in West Fort Worth, build a building, and become one congregation. Many of us had heard of 2 churches merging. A few of us had heard of 3 or 4, but never 5 churches. I can't remember the exact number of elders. I imagine I could ask one of the retired elders. I think that initially we had about 15 or 17 elders for the whole body. It was an amazing process. And what I find interesting about it is that it took an act of God. It took God moving us. We would have sat here in isolation for another who knows how long before we actually, any of us, did much. And instead, God used the Texas Department of Transportation to create the West Freeway Church of Christ. Now, I like to say that, and I say that sincerely, because what that tells me is that we're not here by accident. This is not some fluke of our imagination. This isn't something we generated or we created. This is something God did. Had it been in our hands and in our minds, it would have never happened, because we sat here for 20 years and it didn't happen. And I think finally it was just God's way of saying, okay, time to start moving. Let's get the highway department on board. And they started tearing up the road, and there went the building. And West Freeway was born, all because of an act of God. But if you know anything about God, this is how he always works. You remember what the apostles were doing in Acts, the 1st chapter? Waiting and praying. They were just waiting and praying. But boy, you get to verse 1 in chapter 2, and all of a sudden God acts, and the Holy Spirit comes, and the next thing you know, you got a church of 3,100 members. An amazing thing when God acts. You got an old man named Moses tending sheep and goats out on a mountain. And then God acts in a burning bush. And all of a sudden, Moses is leading God's people out of Egypt. And I could go on down, and you can come up with your own Bible stories of how God moves in such a way to do incredible things among us. And I think sometimes God just gets frustrated with us and has to give us that nudge, that push. It's time. Make it happen. And that's exactly what happened back in 1982 when all of this began to unfold. This is how Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians in the 3rd chapter. He's talking about his work and that of Apollos, another preacher. And he says, beginning in verse 5, what after all is Apollos? What is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. I planted, Apollos watered, God made the increase. And it's not who plants, it's not who waters, it's God who gives the increase. Now, the way it all unfolded, it was special. I don't think there was anybody in that group of leadership or in the congregations themselves that didn't feel like something special was going on. That God was really stepping out of bounds to make something like this happen. If you can take 4 different congregations, different ways of going about it, and then add the 5th small congregation, and everybody be happy, that was amazing. And there was an attitude that not one of us wanted to be the one to make it not work. We were all working very hard to make sure we weren't the stumbling block for anybody else. We felt like we were a part of a special thing that was happening, and it all happened because of what appeared to be a disastrous issue, the state taking the property. But you know, adversity should never frighten us. There was a young man that grew up in hard times, and he could barely make a go of it, but he scraped all the money together that he could, and he bought a grocery store in a little village called New Salem. He got that grocery store up and running, but he had a partner who liked to drink, and the partner drank him out of business. That young man spent the next 10 years paying off the debt on that grocery store, working all kinds of jobs until finally he managed to get a law training and become a lawyer. And then he went into politics, and then he ran for president, became President Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Now, adversity didn't kill him. It prepared him for the special work he felt he had to do as president. And what happened when the state took Sunset's property, it just opened the doors for all the other congregations to say, we want to play too. We want to be part of this. And it was an exciting, special time. And I just wish there were ways to recapture today the energy and the optimism, the excitement we felt. Now, there was another act that was heavily involved in this process, and that's the act I call the act of unity. Everybody that was a part of that process wanted to get along with everybody else. Now, to know that, you got to know the negative side of the story, and I'm not going to badmouth anybody, but there was a sixth congregation. That sixth congregation wanted its way. The other five would not agree. So the sixth congregation took its marbles and went home. It didn't want to participate in the merger. And that's just what they decided. But you know, out of that came this renewed determination, we're going to get along. We're going to get along no matter what it takes. Everybody who experienced that loss, that other congregation not participating, everybody who was involved with that felt very cleanly the responsibility. I'm not going to be the stumbling block. I'm not going to be the one who puts my foot down and say it's got to be my way. And so when we began this process of coming together, there was a great sense of unity among us. We were going to put up with one another. We were going to tolerate one another. We were going to get along with one another no matter what it took. Now, that wasn't always easy. You can't sit in a room full of elders. I got 3 elders back home at Freetown Road Church. I don't always agree with the 3 of them. Imagine multiplying that by 5 to 15 or 17 elders, whatever we had. Plus, we had a whole bunch of preachers in the room. And you know how trouble that is right there. And the one thing about us preachers is you not only will know our opinion, you'll hear it pretty loudly. I think that's preaching 101, I think. So here we have 20-something men in the room, seasoned, experienced leaders in the kingdom, all with different ideas, different views, different thoughts. And I can't tell you how many times I heard things come up and I thought to myself, I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not sure I can go along with that. I'm not sure I'm happy with that one. Now, it never was a doctrinal issue. It never was a matter of somebody didn't believe a truth that the Bible clearly teaches. It was more a matter of how we did things. Are we going to do this or are we going to do that? Are we going to have a bus ministry? We're not going to have a bus ministry. We're going to have a children's Bible hour during worship, or are we not going to have a children's? We had all of those kinds of discussions. And everybody in the room had a different opinion. It was just a fact. Everybody had a different opinion. But the reality was, many people, and I want you to hear this because it's still an important point, many people bit their lip, shut their mouth, and accepted something they weren't thrilled with, because they knew it was for the good of the body. I can tell you how powerful that was. How powerful that was is that we had all these ministers, I think 8. There were 8 ministers, 4 or 5 of us full-time and 3 or 4 of us part-time. And the commitment was for 2 years of employment once the doors here opened. We would have a job for 2 years, and then after that, the elders could make decisions about who stayed and who went. Well, after 6 months, there was attrition already taking place because some preachers and youth ministers, especially the part-timers, knew they weren't going to stay on. But nobody whined. Nobody complained. Nobody said that's not fair. Unity was much more important. Now, let me show you the impact that has. Go over to John in the 20th chapter. In John the 20th chapter, Jesus is praying the last prayer that he'll pray with his disciples. It's in the upper room. It's been a long, difficult night. They've had the Passover. John the 17th chapter, and we'll go down to verse 20. And Jesus is concluding his prayer. And I want you to hear what he prays and how he prays. He says, my prayer is not for them alone, talking about the disciples. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. That's you and me. Jesus was praying for us that night. That all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us. And here's the kicker. If you haven't underlined this, you need to. If we've got unity, the world may believe that you sent me. Now let's shorten that down. When we get along, we convict the world and they become believers. When we don't get along, we convince them just the opposite. Let me put it the backwards way. When we're fussing amongst ourselves, when we're divided and not getting along, the world doesn't think we're Christians at all, and they don't believe in Jesus. But when we create unity, when we all get along, all of a sudden, the world out there gets convicted. And I could take you back to the early 80s and mid-80s. How many people approached me in this community and said, what's going on up there? What are you guys doing? And I get to tell the story. 5 churches are coming together. Wow, that's amazing. I'm going to have to come worship there. And I'd say, yes, you are going to have to do that. It was just a thrilling time. Now, that's not always an easy thing to do. Go over to Ephesians in chapter 4 real quick. Ephesians chapter 4, Paul is encouraging the church in Ephesus to be unified. He starts in verse 1, as a prisoner for the Lord, because Paul was in jail when he wrote this, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. Okay, I want to be worthy of my calling. How do I do that? Well, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing one with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There's one body, one Spirit, just as you were called, and one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who's over all and through all and all. Now go back to verse 2. Humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love. Now, I'm not a genius, but I have taught a lot of couples in couples therapy that to bear with somebody means to put up with what they're doing. And I don't know if in your marriage you ever had your spouse do something that irritated you. My wife's experienced that a few times. What do? You put up with them if you're going to get along, right? In this merger, there was an attitude of unity. We're going to get along. And that meant tolerating each other's differences. That meant tolerating each other's opinions. That meant putting up with the things that we didn't always like or want to see happen. It meant putting up with all kinds of decisions that got made. But one of the great things was from the beginning, once a decision was made in that eldership, once a decision was made, it was unified. It was a whole, everybody was on board. I can remember when we bought this property. There was a vote about this property and some on the other side of the interstate, on the south side of Interstate 30. And you know what? The vote was, as I recall, was about 10-7, something like that, to buy here. But when they came out of that meeting and they announced the decision, it was 17-0. And everybody got on board with that decision. And that just happened over and over and over and over again. And what we created then was a situation where what mattered more than anything else was that we make this work. That we let God bless it the way He wanted to and make West Freeway be what God wanted it to be. Since He was the author, the startup, it was an act of God to get this going, we trusted He would know what's best to keep us moving. And I would just encourage that still be our attitude, that this be the kind of place where people can come and be safe. Heard a preacher once tell a story about his hometown in Britt, South Dakota, a little town, 1,200 people. Everybody came in from the outlying farms to go into school there. But if you know anything about South Dakota, the winters are pretty harsh. And sometimes, well, they're used to the cold and they're used to the snow, but when the wind joins the party, that's called a blizzard. And when there were blizzards, the school buses wouldn't go back out into the countryside. So it wasn't unusual for the kids to get to school, blizzard blow in, and no way to get home. So in that community, and I've discovered later in several other communities up there, they created a place for the kids to go. They asked the townspeople, people who lived in the city limits, to take in one of the students that lived out on a farm. It was kind of their home away from home. Preacher talked about that because when he came back to town to visit some of his relatives who were still there, a young man walked up to him about his age. He says, I used to stay at your house. Yours was my storm home. That's what they called them, storm homes. You go to your storm home if there's a blizzard, and you just spend the night there, and then the next day you go back to school, and then you go home that night if you can. What a great concept for the church. This should be a storm home. This should be a place where all of the nonsense and the junk that weighs people down and beats them up and That's left at the door. We can come in here and everybody be safe and loved and accepted and tolerated. And that's what was going on when the West Freeway congregation was born. It's what made it such an exciting time. I think I learned more about unity from watching those elders work together than at any other time in my life. And then there was one other act that had to be dealt with, and that was what I would call the act of submission. You know, when you make up your mind that you're not going to get your way, it's a little bit concerning, you know, especially if you're convinced that your idea is the best idea. And we had those kinds of conversations. But every time the ministers would talk, every time the deacons got together, even the Bible class teachers, when we would have a teachers meeting or something before we actually got in the building, there was a great spirit of submission. An attitude of, I don't have to have my way. And that is still one of the most important principles for any Christian, leader, elder, deacon, or minister, is to have that attitude that says, I can submit on this issue and it won't hurt me, and I'll trust God that it won't hurt the church. There was a spirit of submission. I can tell you, because once we decided, we got in here and we decided to create a new eldership, it was decided that they would do it in a certain way that was going to leave about 12 men, I think, or may have been 10, and the rest would step down as elders. Well, all of the men in the room had to agree to that process to make that work, and they all agreed. Now, when they agreed, 4 or 5 of them knew they were voting themselves out of a job, but they submitted. We created a new eldership from the nucleus of the old, and the spirit of unity just kept right on going. And I'll confess, got a lot of preachers here, you can back me up on this. You get 3 preachers in a room and you've got 3 conversations going, nobody listening. That's just what, it's kind of like a family reunion in our family. Everybody's talking, nobody's listening. And I have yet to meet a preacher that doesn't have a pretty firm opinion about just about anything. He'll say what's on his mind. But even among those ministers, there was a great spirit of cooperation. There was a great attitude of, okay, this is your ministry. If you're doing youth, you do youth, I'll stay out of it. I was doing the education ministry, and the other ministers were very helpful. They would teach classes, they would do this, but they let me make the decisions about how that ministry functioned. And always that means somebody was submitting their will to the bigger will of the body or to those chosen to lead it. And it was refreshing. It was refreshing to have elders who would say, this is your job, and then stay out of your way while you did it. It was refreshing to have elders who trusted you to do that work. And see, all of that is submission at work. Letting go of the reins, trusting God will work in this person, and it will work if I let go. It was an exciting time of submission. And I think that reflects what Paul writes to the Philippians. Go to chapter 2 in Philippians. Beginning in verse 1, Paul says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. I saw that for 2 years as this church came together. An attitude of submission. Before we actually came into this property and we got our building built, and if you want to know about the power of unity and the power of submission, you ought to sit in a few building committee meetings and have conversations about what should be in a church building. Some heads were butted in those meetings. But at the same time, by the time it was all done, look at this. I was thinking that a while ago when we were singing. I forgot how good the singing is here. It's just, the acoustics in here are awesome. Whoever came up with this did good. It was a joy. But the fact of the matter is that the submission went all the way through. Everybody was looking to everybody else's interest. I want them to be happy. I want them to get what they need. I want them to be satisfied. And so there were a lot of things that were decided that some of us didn't agree on. I see you still have a lot of the red, said Sarah. You know, the pretty wears out a long time before the carpet does. Have you ever noticed that? Anyway, there were discussions about the red carpet. There were discussions about this and about that. But somebody always said, it doesn't have to be my way. I'll give in on that. And you know, when you're building a $2.5 or $3 million building, I can't remember the exact figure that was on this when we constructed it, but when you're building something like that, you're going to have lots of discussions about what's important and what you need and how's it going to work. And yet, everybody turned the other cheek. Everybody went the second mile. Everybody tried to keep that attitude that was the same as Jesus Christ. Being completely humble, putting others first. It was so refreshing. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I constantly did, it constantly kept me and everybody else from wanting to be the one to have to have my way. I wasn't going to stand out as the sore thumb, let somebody else get that job. But when you've got that attitude, it's amazing what you can accomplish. It's amazing what you can do. So go back over to one more place in Romans in the 15th chapter, because this was what was going on in those meetings and those discussions and in those times when we started actually coming together. We who are strong, verse 1 of Romans 15, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. I'm always amazed when I read those words. If I'm strong and you're weak, I should get my way because obviously I'm strong, I know better. But Paul puts it just the other way. If you're really that strong, you ought to be able to please the other guy, even though he is the weak member. And that was not an easy thing. Like I mentioned, we didn't have a bunch of rookies in our leadership team. From the elders, many of whom had decades of experience, to the ministers, many of whom had even more. It was remarkable the kind of expertise and wisdom we had in the room, and yet everybody had this attitude, I'm not going to have to get my way. The end result was we were able to put together something very special. You know, a true story happened about 3 or 4 years ago. A long-distance runner in a marathon. He was in second place. His name was Ivan Fernandez Anaya, and he was running a good race, but he was behind the Olympic gold medalist for that year, Abel Mokai, I think was his name, out of Nigeria. He was well ahead. But for some reason, as he trailed the leader, he saw him stop, and apparently Abel thought he had crossed the finish line. So he stopped, just standing there, waiting for the other racers. But the finish line was another 100 yards or so. Well, Ivan knew that. But when he got even with Abel, instead of shooting on by him to win, he stopped and he began to motion him, encourage him, try to get him to see where the finish line was. And they trotted across the finish line with Ivan letting Abel win the race. Ivan's coach was livid. You go out to compete to win, you should have won. But he said, I could have gotten past him, but he clearly had the race won. I wasn't going to take it away from him on that basis. He said, that's not the kind of person I am. And I just think back to the days that we all came together, the heady, exciting, wonderful days as God was moving among us and we believed it and felt it. Not one of us was going to cross that line ahead of somebody else. It was okay for them to win. It was a constant thing. So as we close, there's one or two other points I want to make. And that is that if you're going to be the West Freeway congregation, you need to continue to watch for God to open some doors. He did it 30-something years ago. He'll do it again. God can do amazing things. And all we need to do is be open to it and receptive to it. And not only look for that act of God, make unity your priority. And you do that by learning to be submissive. A young rabbi had taken his older rabbi's place. The older man had retired, gone into a nursing home. And the young rabbi did not know what to do because every Friday evening in the service, They would have a prayer. Half the church would stand up and half the church would sit down. But that wasn't the bad part. As soon as the prayer was over, the ones standing were yelling at the ones sitting, you should be standing, and the ones sitting were yelling at the ones over here, you should be sitting. Happened at every service in every prayer. Half of them standing and hollering, the other half sitting and hollering. Exasperated, the young rabbi went to the old rabbi who had retired, 99 years old, sitting there in his little wheelchair. He said, "Rabbi, I've got a problem. So what do I do about this?" And he explained, half of them stand and half of them sit. He said, "What was the tradition? Did you stand for your prayers?" He said, "No, that wasn't the tradition." "So, okay, the tradition was you sat for your prayers." "No, that wasn't the tradition either." He said, "Well, I don't know what to do. We've got chaos. Everybody's mad and yelling at one another." And our old rabbi said, "That was the tradition." One of the great things about the West Freeway congregation is it never behaved that way. It never acted that way in the beginning, and I praise to God it never acts that way again. A church that believes in the hand of God moving among us, a church that is unified, and a church that is submissive can conquer West Fort Worth today. And that's why this story is so exciting. I wish you could have been there this past week when I was working on this outline. I had to get up and run around the church a few times. It was just exciting. I remembered how good it felt to be a part of this. So let's close with a prayer. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the way you moved among us back in the 1980s and how you led us to this point. Father, I admit we would have never gotten here on our own. This was your work. So, Father, help us to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Help us to look to each other's interests and not to our own. Help us, Father, to have the mind of your Son, Jesus the Christ, who died for the church. And help us, Father, live for it in such a way that we will bring glory to you. It is through Jesus we pray, and amen.
Thank you, David. We're going to take about a 10-minute break, and Brian will lead us back into the auditorium and with some singing. So let's take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back in with some singing. Thanks, David, so much. Appreciate your lesson. Let's